Good morning, good afternoon, depending on time zones. Hopefully it's not too early if you're on the West Coast. That'd be 8 a.m., I guess. Europe, I guess, getting later in the day, depending on our audience. I'm going to be talking today about Copilot and security readiness and our thoughts around how do you build a 90-day plan for rolling out Microsoft 365 information protection. Now, obviously, this changes depending on the size of your organization. If you're a global multinational, we're probably not going to be able to roll it out in 90 days for you. But a lot of our clients are in the, a couple hundred to maybe a couple thousand users in their Microsoft 365, and it is absolutely doable from that point of view. So let's start with introductions here. My name's Peter Carson. I'm the president founder of Envision IT, also 15 times Microsoft M365 MVP. That program's kind of evolved over the years, started in SharePoint, and then evolved into M365. I speak at a lot of industry conferences. In fact, if you're going to be down in Dallas the week after next, I'll be down there for TechCon and heading over to Dublin for European SharePoint Conference the beginning of December. So I always enjoy giving these talks, whether they're webinar like these or live in-person events. This is actually a Teams meeting. We were just chatting as we were getting organized for this. We should probably start using the Teams webinar. So it is completely live and open. We do ask folks to stay muted, but the chat is open. I can't promise to watch it, but Logan, Kevin, others that are sort of helping with the delivery here can keep an eye on. And if there's an appropriate spot to address a question that comes up, absolutely, I'll try and pause and take those because I do love having the questions through there. I will try. This is a new deck for me, so timing is still TBD, but I'll try and hold a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A. I can always hang back if folks want to hang a little longer to ask questions from there as well. We do record, so the recording will be available within 24 hours. And welcome, enjoy, and hope you learned something here. So I just like to start with some key takeaways. What should you be looking for coming out of this webinar? And this is not a Copilot webinar, but the information protection topic that we're going to be talking about is very foundational for Copilot readiness. Oversharing and unknown sensitivity are both significant risks from a Copilot point of view. It can surface stuff up to the wrong people or not tell people that it's surfacing up highly sensitive information if you don't have things like Purview in place at that. So it's something that a lot of our clients are looking at and starting to roll out. We've got about half a dozen of these projects in flight right now as part of that. And that it can be implemented with a prescriptive plan. And this is sort of our take on what that prescriptive plan could be. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Take from it what's appropriate to your organization and go from there. I suppose a little background for those of you that maybe are new to Envision IT, haven't joined one of our webinars or talks before. We are both a products and a services company. So we provide consulting services primarily in the Greater Toronto area. We're a Canadian company, but sometimes more broadly from that point of view. But we also have a number of products, particularly around our M365 Tenant dashboard that we're going to be talking about as part of this prescriptive plan. It's not a required, but it's certainly something that helps a lot. We also have Extranet User Manager, which is all about the external sharing. We're actually going to be doing a sort of a sister webinar to this one probably later in November, kind of following on this from an information protection from an external point of view, which we won't go too deep into today's topic. So for today, we're going to talk a little background on Copilot trends and data risks, some definitions of what information protection is and what Microsoft Purview is, and then we'll dive right into the playbook itself and what that looks like. These stats, I actually gave a talk at the beginning of this month at the Microsoft AI Tour here in Toronto, and some of these slides at the beginning come from that deck that Microsoft provided to me. Some of them are a little old, like this is May 2023, which feels like a lifetime from an AI point of view. Things have changed so much from that point of view. So, take these with a grain of salt from that point of view, but I think the topic is still very hot from that point of view. Everybody's trying to develop an AI strategy. It is still very early days. It feels like, everybody wants to be on it and leveraging it and using it. We certainly are. We have Copilot for all of our staff, whether it's M365 Copilot for our sort of admin, sales, marketing, operations staff, or Copilot for GitHub from the engineering team point of view. So we are leveraging it across the board, and it is transformational from that point of view. I can't imagine not having my M365 Copilot open all day. It's like I just have a constant ongoing conversation on topics with it from that point of view. But getting it rolled out appropriately is a concern. Securing your organizational data is a top priority. One of the big benefits of M365 Copilot, it has access to all of your work data, and it accesses it in your context. So whatever you have access to it, your agent has access to as well, which can be good or bad. If you have access to things that maybe you shouldn't, that have been overshared, for example, that can be a risk for an organization. That's part of what we're going to talk about here today. So that, bottom bullet around data oversharing and leakage concerns is a big thing, not just from an external, but from an internal point of view as well. So how do we solve that? It is a complex problem. There's all sorts of different types of data, different users, different objectives. I mean, we're going to be fairly focused on Microsoft 365, and not even all of that. We're fairly focused on SharePoint. That's our history, and documents, whether that's SharePoint on its own or underneath Microsoft Teams. We're not going to be getting so much into Teams messages and email labeling and things like that, which are absolutely part of Purview and information protection as well. But from a Copilot point of view and a sort of document ingestion point of view, what's in your SharePoint is often the biggest piece of content from that perspective. So what is Microsoft's approach to data security? I pulled this slide actually from my AI Tour talk as well. I thought it was a good one. The key point that I made in that session, if you attended that session and that's why you're here on this webinar, apologies for the audio on there. I didn't control the AV there. I'm hoping you can hear me much better this time. It was kind of a crazy venue from that point of view. But I made the point there that three of these corners, top left and the two bottom, are very reactive parts to information protection. Data loss prevention, for example, would be I'm attaching a document to an email that I'm going to send to somebody, but it's detected that there's sensitive content in there, and maybe I shouldn't be sharing that with that person. So it's as the incorrect action is happening, it's trying to block it and prevent it from that point of view. So it's reacting to that. Same thing with it inside of risk management. Somebody's about to leave the organization, they've been let go, and they've just downloaded 20,000, documents off of your SharePoint, for example, or out of Teams. That's obviously a concern from a risk management point of view, and it can flag that, but it's after the fact. It says, hey, I saw this behavior. You probably need to investigate it and launch something from an insider risk point of view around it. And there's broader data security investigations that it can help manage from that point of view as well. But we're going to focus mainly on the top right corner, which is information protection. And this is a very proactive in my mind. It's you planning ahead to say, hey, let's properly label and manage and control our content so they won't have to try and intercept when somebody's doing the wrong thing. It's already done from that point of view. So why do you want to do information protection first if you're planning on rolling out Copilot? Well, permissions and oversharing, I already mentioned, is a significant concern. Even internal to the organization, default sharing links may be incorrectly set. People may be sharing with the wrong people and not realizing, and even things like the everyone except external users group that exists in every tenant that Microsoft is, I think they've either shut it down or they're about to shut it down. I mean, that raised a lot of security holes where things got shared to a much broader community, or maybe even across the whole organization. And maybe that wasn't somebody's intent. They didn't understand that was what they were doing. But the reality is that now that information is available. And today that may be hidden. I like to phrase it as security through obscurity, which is a really bad way of doing security. People don't discover it. They don't realize they have it. Okay, then that risk hasn't triggered from that point of view. But Copilot kind of amplifies that risk. It says, hey, I'm going to access anything that you have access to, whether you realize you have access or not, and then give you data back from that. So there might be things that come back from Copilot's answers to a worker that gives them information that they're actually not supposed to know. So how do we make sure that we address that from an oversharing point of view? So it provides some guardrails around that. But it's not just the permissions, it's also what's the classification of the information that it's sharing. So there's a data discovery and classification component to Purview that says, hey, what's low sensitivity and what's high sensitivity in your organization, and how do we apply those labels to that? So when people are using that content, they understand this is highly sensitive. I need to treat it accordingly from that point of view. And those labels can be applied to workspaces or to individual documents, to emails, to Teams messages, to lots of different artifacts within your Microsoft tenant. And they can be manually applied. You can say, hey, I know this is sensitive content. I'm going to apply a label to it. We're also going to talk about AI-powered classifiers that can actually look for that content by patterns and through AI rules to say, hey, this looks like a health card number from a provincial health point of view. Well, that's highly sensitive information, or it's PHI data. We need to treat that appropriately. Or maybe we're in financial and this is PCI, personal credit information, again, needs to be highly sensitive, credit card numbers, things like that. Actually don't want to store that in your systems. You shouldn't be putting it in Excel and Word documents in the first place, but maybe it's there. Maybe you haven't done a good job from a data governance point of view. You want to be able to find that, label that, and maybe even just clean it up and get it out of your system. The danger is if you don't do that, Copilot doesn't understand what's highly sensitive and what's not. You don't just answer the question that people ask, and it won't tell them that that answer itself could be highly sensitive. But if Copilot knows about it, if the labels are applied, then it can infer that to its answers. If you say, hey, Copilot, give me a PowerPoint deck that summarizes our internal profit loss statements from the finance team. That maybe I'm part of the finance group, and that's a reasonable question to ask, but those documents are considered highly sensitive. Label the PowerPoint deck appropriately for that. So I know that this isn't for public consumption. It's not more broadly available. So I've given a lot of talks over the years. In fact, there's some recordings up on our Envision IT website around what's called the traffic light protocol. It's something the UK government kind of came up as a concept in the early 2000s. It was adopted in the US from a government cybersecurity point of view more recently. And the idea is just a very simple, not a lot of levels to it. Don't make this complicated for people to figure out. Clear, green, amber, red. Now, you don't need to use those labels. We work a lot with the Ontario provincial government and municipalities. Their legislation defines a low, medium, high, but it's the same idea. There's 3 levels. It's super easy to understand which is the high one and which is the low one. So there's no confusion from that point of view. We've adapted it a bit from the UK standard. They had a strict amber versus non-strict concept. The idea there was, is this internalized only to our organization, or can it be shared externally? And we gave the same idea at the red level with the highly sensitive, only because we work with some organizations where highly sensitive information does need to be shared external to the organization. You're an insurance company, you're dealing with claims and health records and things like that, and you need to share it back and forth with health providers that are outside of your organization, as an example. Those should be encrypted. They should be red labels from that point of view, but they should be allowed to share in certain scenarios through there. So it's not a one size fits all, but the concept is there. The labels are adaptable, but the idea is not too many labels. 3 is great. A 4th for hey, there is no sensitivity on this from a clear point of view, and then clear understanding in your organization what that actually means. So what we did, the labels don't define how they should work in Microsoft 365. They're more conceptual. So we said, hey, let's define what those labels mean from an M365 point of view. Now, a lot of our work is dealing with external sharing and such, not the topic for today, but you can see there's a focus here on that external access is blocked on the red strict and the amber strict labels. That idea being that these documents are either amber or red sensitivity, but they're internalized only. They should only be used within our organization, whereas the amber and the red do allow external access. Green is fairly low sensitivity. That's okay from an external access point of view. Now, MFA, multi-factor authentication. When you sign into your Microsoft 365, I'm hoping as a member in your tenant, everybody goes through multi-factor authentication. That should just be table stakes for every organization, and ideally using Microsoft Authenticator. It's more convenient once it's set up, and it's more secure than text or phone call based MFA. But there's always a lot of debate. Should our guests have to go through MFA? Well, maybe they're accessing green content. Maybe the green content is training information, and we don't want them to have to go through MFA. We want to make sure they get the safety training. So that's fine. We don't require MFA there. But everything above that, yes, we should be requiring MFA, whether you're a member of the organization or you're an external person. The last column there, the document encryption, this is an important one to understand as well. So when you apply a label to a document, if I'm applying an amber label by this definition, it's not changing the document, it's not controlling the document, it's more informational. If I put an amber strict label on a document and I get it out of that strict location and attach it in an email and send it to somebody, unless I have a DLP policy, it'll let me do that. And that external person can see that document. So there's limited control you can put around that. But if you encrypt that document, which is what we recommend for read sensitivity documents, whether I'm inside or outside that organization, I need to sign in and prove that I'm allowed to see that document. So you can control it regardless of where it resides. I can pull that down onto a thumb drive, give it to my buddy at a bar, he can put it in his laptop. You can't do anything with it. If he doesn't have the credentials to open and decrypt that document, that's basically useless to him from that point of view. So we feel that's important from a high sensitivity point of view. And there's some things that you need to do, I'll touch on in terms of setting up that encryption. So benefits of that traffic light protocol in Microsoft 365, it's a very clear and consistent classification. People can get their heads around it to understand what's low, what's high. Maybe it's literally called low and high from that point of view. You've got a secure external sharing approach. You're applying MFA appropriately. You're applying encryption appropriately from that point of view. And you're getting all that through Microsoft Purview. So let's bring that back to our topic today, which is more around Copilot and how does this information protection help with Copilot success, and what do I need to do to prepare for that? So this isn't just Purview, this is sort of general, how do you prepare for Copilot success? Well, the first step is to consolidate and clean. If you've got a bunch of content that's still in file shares, and we're still doing file share migration projects for clients that haven't fully moved into the cloud, it's very much still a thing in 2025. Copilot's not going to find that content. It needs to be in the cloud and accessible to the AI agents for Copilot to be able to leverage it. So if you're not fully in the cloud and you want to leverage Copilot against that data, I mean, there's other things that you could do to index and crawl it, but out of the box, the best path is get it up into the cloud from that point of view. But also clean it. The old garbage in, garbage out metaphor, that if you've got a lot of redundant data, outdated data, that you don't want Copilot answering off of that data, remove it or remove it from the scope for Copilot. You don't have to light Copilot up against your entire tenant. You can parcel it out and say, only use this portion of it. Okay, so I've got things clean and organized in my tenant. Now I should start thinking about securing and labeling it. Do I have the right permissions in there? Has there been oversharing? Do I have sensitivity labels applied? Do I have data loss prevention policies in there? Make sure I've got all of that in place. The third one, change management training, huge, important thing. What we're doing here is going to change the user experience and how people interact. It's important that people understand that. So pre-doing this, you got to socialize the ideas, let them know what this means, what you're asking them to do, and how it's going to change what they normally do. And then as you go through the rollout, we'll talk about doing pilot groups versus broader rollout. Make that change management and that training a key part of it from that point of view. Not just on how do I use Copilot, but what does all this information protection stuff mean to me and what does that look like? And then continue to improve governance. Security is not a done and dusted. It's something that you keep updating and reviewing and applying from that point of view. There's governance tools out there. We'll talk about some of our own, as well as the Microsoft ones to help monitor and manage that. But the two big things from a Copilot readiness point of view are that permissions side and the sensitivity side. That's what we're going to focus on here. So I already mentioned, how it shapes the Copilot outcomes, so the labels bound not only what it can retrieve, but how it inherits the sensitivity of its source data. So it's important from that point of view. Okay, let's flip over. Let's talk about this, idea of a 90-day rollout. Is it a pipe dream or is it achievable? What does that look like? And actually, it was interesting. I had a call with somebody that was coming to the AI tour. It's a new client. We actually landed the business. We haven't started the project yet. And before I had announced this webinar, I said, what's a reasonable time frame? And I kind of had the structure for it out there. I said, I think like 90 days is reasonable and plan around that. So we baked that in and made that part of the plan. We're going to be starting on November 1. We got the holidays in there, so we're going to be a little bit feet to the fire from that point of view. But I do feel it's absolutely achievable. We got a couple of others that are, already in flight. They're very much in the planning and about to start the pilot phases from that point of view. So kind of break it up into 3 months. Say, hey, month 1, we're not actually going to do anything. We're going to do that actually changes anything in your tenant. We're going to do planning, and we're going to need input from the business around this to understand Do you have the right structure in place? What sort of labels are you going to apply? What are the rules going to be around that? I mean, we've got prescriptive guidance, but the idea is it's a starting point. You may want to tweak some of those depending on your organization. Month two, let's pilot this. Like, let's don't roll it out across your entire tenant. Let's get a pilot group. We typically see sort of a dozen, 2 dozen people as part of those pilots, and look at publishing those labels out and applying that to their working areas. So it very much depends on what was done in month one to identify what those areas are. And often the pilot for the information protection rollout aligns with the pilot for Copilot as well, because often most organizations aren't buying Copilot licenses for everybody in the org. They're saying, hey, let's get a pilot group going from that point of view. But once you have that pilot going, how do you then roll that out to the organization? And maybe that's not a 1 month piece. Maybe that takes more months from there. If there's significant sort of restructuring, reorganization of your tenant is happening in that. I give a talk called Teams First Information Architecture around how you structure your content that can actually play well into this as well. So if there's more work happening there, that is rolled into sort of 6-8 month projects where we've had 30, 40 different departments in an organization that we're doing that reorganization around. It obviously takes longer to work through that in a larger organization. Let's dive into the phase one planning. And it really starts with an inventory to understand, what do I have in my tenant? And there's a lot of third-party tools out there. In fact, in one of my other presentations, I call those tools out. I should probably have put it in this one here. We have our M365 tenant dashboard on the right. There's tools like the SharePoint Admin Center, the broader M365 Admin Center, the Purview Center. They can do some of that inventory, give you an understanding of active sites, inactive sites. In fact, for one of my previous talks, I published up on GitHub an open source tenant dashboard as well that you can get for free. It's available up on our site. So we'll send some follow-up links on that. It doesn't go nearly as deep as our commercial product, but it will tell you, here's a Power BI report of all of our sites and how active are they and what labels do they have applied to them and things like that from that point of view. You can write your own PowerShell scripts and do this as well. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. I'm going to focus more on our tenant dashboard. This is one of the tabs in here. I'm going to use our development site. This is actually our live one that I've got screenshotted in here of Envision IT. It's just starting its 90-day plan as well. So we're trying to do it for the shoemaker's children as well. We often don't get shoes for them, but our goal is to actually do it on this one here. So what's under the hood? What's actually happening here? So I don't have all the pieces in here, but basically we have what we call our data harvester, and there's a consent process you go through as a client to say, hey, allow us to collect data from your M365 tenant, metadata, not the actual document contents, and bring it into a Power BI model so we can see the dashboard from there. And then a key feature of it is we also have an Excel dashboard that's connected to that model. So we can pull the data from the big data set, typically a subset of it. We kind of want to summarize it at this level here. And you can start to categorize and record decisions in this Excel. And then what we've just launching out now is the ability to take the output of those decisions that you've made, like I want to apply these Purview labels on these workspaces, and push them out into an Excel CSV and some PowerShell and actually action those into your tenant to say, hey, I actually want to apply those labels as part of that. I'm going to come back to the dashboard in a minute. I want to come back to the Purview side and spend a little time to talk about the labels and the terminology itself, because we've got a lot of different moving pieces here. So these are not our labels. These are the Microsoft labels in the products itself. They're not all Purview. Most are, though. And I'm going to take you into the Purview and Enter ID consoles as well to take you through this. Probably the most important one is this concept of a sensitivity label. It gets applied to either an individual document or email or Teams message, or to a whole workspace like a team or a Microsoft 365 group. So the labels define what's the classification of the content, but it also defines the rules. Does this need to be encrypted? Can it be shared externally? Those sorts of things from that point of view. And then also in Purview, you define policies, which are basically rules for publishing those labels out and enforcing them in your Microsoft 365 tenant. Classifiers are things for auto-applying labels. Now, that's an E5 feature. So if you don't have the top tier E5, you don't have the auto classifiers as part of that. You can still do manual classification, and that comes back to the inventory process. And honestly, most of our clients that are starting this process, they're looking at doing both to say, hey, if we have E5, let's use the trainable classifiers to go find that sensitive content for us. But let's also do a manual process. Let's talk to the business and say, hey, finance, how many teams do you have, and what do you do in them, and where do you keep your sensitive content, and how is it organized from that point of view? So it is a multi-pronged process as you're doing this inventory of both automation and just plain old talking to the business. The last two are more enter ID focused to say, hey, if some of my labels say, for example, this workspace can't be shared externally, they use what's called an authentication context and a conditional access policy in your enter ID to say, block this from a security point of view, right down at the bottom level. So, that site can't be shared out, or that site requires MFA for these people. Those sorts of rules get applied in your conditional access policies. You do need at least enter ID P1 to do those. I kind of consider that table stakes. Every org should have that now. The security defaults that come without that are too broad, don't let you allow this sort of granular control from that point of view. So you need to define your own map from this point of view, and then define your labels and structures from that perspective. Now, I'd hoped to launch this out as a white paper before the webinar. We're going to have to do it as a follow-up afterwards, but let me actually pull up the document we've got here. So this is an internal document that we've created that's kind of step-by-step of how you actually deploy the traffic light protocol in your tenant. It's something we can do for clients, but I'm happy to share it as gated content up on our website as well. If you want to do this yourself and use this as a guideline, go ahead. If you find differences, gaps, suggestions, by all means, feed those back from that point of view. So it gives an overview of what TLP is, what are some of the prerequisites that you need to set up, things like the authentication context and the conditional access policies, security groups, and then it gets into the details of actually defining the labels. It is written from an administrator's perspective, so it is a very technical document. It literally gets into PowerShell that you need to run, and which PowerShell and what modules you need to use. If you haven't worked with PowerShell from an admin point of M365 point of view, it can be a little confusing to get it going, but it's super handy once you get it running from that point of view. So it's very step-by-step. Some of it refers to outside Microsoft Learn articles, like setting up the encryption services in Azure Information Protection. That's a prerequisite for the red labels. Your conditional access policies, MFA, that whole side. Security groups for and managing encryption. And then it gets into the details of actually creating the sensitivity labels. And it step-by-step see you through the screens. Full caveat, Microsoft loves to change their admin screens. So, these may already be out of date, or they could be shortly in the future. It's hard to keep them current from that point of view. But the concepts should apply from that point of view. So we will be making that available to webinar registrants as part of that. But basically, most of what you're doing from that document is going to be here in the Purview admin portal. So you do need an administrator in your tenant. You go to purview.microsoft.com, that will get you in here. This is our dev tenant, so it's pretty messy. We kind of break it and make a mess of it all the time. So if I come down here from a sensitivity label coverage and security point of view, actually this was showing me before a different stat from a percentage point of view. We'll come back to that. Oh, there we go. It was under the reports. So you can actually get some reports in here to understand what state is your tenant in currently and what does that look like. But the sensitivity labels section here is where you're actually going to define those labels. So you can see we've defined these TLP labels through here according to the rules that are in that document. So we've got the green, amber, red, and the strict options from that. We've set up the conditional access policies to enforce the sharing restriction. We've set up the encryption and all that from it. I can't get into all those details there. We only have 45 minutes, but those details are all in the document. Once you have your labels defined, then you can get into your policies to say, hey, how am I going to push those labels out into the organization? And you can have, one label for everything. You can have one policy, one label. It's kind of up to you how you structure it from that point of view. I think we've gone both ways in this tenant from this point of view. Now, you can also come into the classifier section. So this is where we get into more of the E5 license side. You can say, hey, let's set up trainable classifiers on our content. Now, Microsoft provides a ton of these out of the box. So it's 114 different items. In fact, I can filter it down to say, hey, I want to look at particular style of classifiers and sensitive information types. So we're here in Canada here. I can actually search off of Canada and say, hey, what are the other box rules that we have for bank account numbers, driver's license, health card numbers, passport numbers, things like that. So, kind of mix and match and look at these through there from that point of view. Ultimately, underneath the hood, a lot of these are regular expressions, which are looking for some pattern of letters and numbers and check digits and things like that in your documents to say, hey, I think this has a bank account number in it. I should apply a sensitivity label to it from that point of view. They're confusing to figure out. We were playing around with this yesterday and actually just taking those regexes from these definitions, pasting them into Copilot and say, explain to me what this is doing. Copilot's actually really good at giving an English language description of exactly what the rules are doing from that point of view. So Copilot can actually help with a lot of the planning processes around here from that perspective. So basically, you're going to be building these labels out and publishing them and making them available in your tenant. At this point, you haven't applied them to anything. They're not actually doing anything. They're just ready and waiting to be used from that perspective. So as we start to plan out what this looks like, in fact, this is probably a good time to flip over to the tenant dashboard itself. So I'm in our development portal. We have a customer-facing portal.envisionit.com, where if you were setting up a trial, and we're going to explain how you do that, you'd have access to your dashboard through here. So what this is showing me is kind of a high-level view at this point here of what's going on in my organization. It looks like a lot of information. It can be a little overwhelming. We're trying to hit, a number of different things that you might want to do in this. This is not just about rolling out information protection. It's about stale content. It's about, running out of storage space in your tenant. There's a lot of different things you might want to use this for from that point of view. One of the key things we're seeing up the top here is how active or stale is this content. The green less than 90 days, those are the workspaces that somebody's done something in the last 90 days. And you can see that's actually a pretty small piece in here. It's Power BI, so it's interactive. I can click into those and filter the other views down. Say, hey, I've got 7,000 documents in those 33 workspaces that have a mix of different labels and sharing allowed to them. In fact, only one of them, or only 3 of them, have a label applied, and only one has an action to further apply a label. So there's more work I need to do to build this out from here. Now, one of the things that helps when you've got sort of information overload, you say, I've got too many workspaces, too many documents, I don't even know where to start, is to start to build some categories. So I built this TLP category here to say, hey, I want to filter the view down to a smaller set of workspaces. Maybe this represents one department, maybe it represents my pilot group, and let's scope it down and make it more manageable from that point of view. And actually, we've done a fair bit from a TLP point of view. We've got labels applied across a lot of those workspaces, even though we've still got a set sensitivity label, and I'll explain why that is in a minute through here. So how did that category get defined? Well, if we come back to the PowerPoint for a second, it's really this Excel part here. So there's sort of 2 sides to that. This is our tenant dashboard Excel file, and what it does is it uses Power Query to connect up to that Power BI report that I was showing you there. So there's a whole bunch of queries here that pulls that data out. No, Excel decided to stop responding here. There we go. There's a bunch of queries, so it pulls down what I was seeing in the Power BI. Like, what are my workspaces? What are my libraries? What are my documents, my users, and such through there? So if I come over to my workspaces tab, you can see I filled in this column here in the Excel to say these are the pilot workspaces that I want to focus on. So I basically just type that into the Excel. I can use whatever filtering I want to of maybe I know owners or departments. Maybe I'm looking at the last update around it. Maybe I'm looking what hub site it belongs to, who the owner emails. Like, there's a lot of different ways I can start to use this to discover and identify and categorize where I want to focus in on. Now you can see we're already set an action for those categories as well to set a sensitivity label. Now a bunch of them are being set because we run through this process, but this is the idea is to define a category, pull the scope in that you want to focus on from that point of view, and decide what labels you should be applying to those workspaces. This is sort of the first part of the planning process, is to do it at the workspace level. So we can take the output from this. If I come over to this SharePoint Actions tab, I can save this as a CSV and run some PowerShell, and it will actually take these actions on here to say, hey, I'm actually going to apply these labels to these workspaces, and here's the label values that I want to apply. Now we pulled a number of admins around approach and from a product feedback point of view, what's the best way to do this? A lot of the folks we talked to said, we're comfortable as administrators working in PowerShell. We kind of don't want your product to be changing things in our tenant. We'd rather you just tell us what's going to be changed, give us a script and let us run that and do that. So this is our first pass at that. It's super techy if you're not familiar with PowerShell, but basically I run this, I'm running it in Visual Studio Code because it's kind of easier to see what it's doing from that point of view. And it says, hey, do you want to process labels or do you want to set up the app from a security point of view, which you don't necessarily have to do. You can use your own credentials. I'm going to point it at our Envision IT Dev tenant and pull in that CSV file to say, hey, go ahead and apply those things. So it prompts me to say, hey, I need your credentials to take these actions. Yeah, I'm going to consent that. I'm in the dev tenant, so I'm going to use that credential. And I can come back over here and it's running through and you can see, hey, it's applying sensitivity labels to the workspaces. It's also applying labels to libraries. We've got some removing sharing links and unique permissions features that we're adding there as well. So it's gone and done that work for me. I can inspect the code and get comfortable to understand exactly what it's doing. It's using a lot of PNP to run that. That's sort of one approach that we had. The other approach, which we haven't built yet, we've kind of just mocked it up in here, is to take those actions that are recorded in the dashboard and bring them into a web page like this to say, hey, I want you to go, apply those sensitivity labels to these teams and hit a go button and have the app do that for me. It would still take me through a login. It would still use a delegated security to go do that, but I didn't have to worry about PowerShell and details. We kind of think some people will like this, some people like the other. We're going to send a follow-up survey after the webinar, and I'd love to get feedback from that point of view. But let's come back to the steps from a planning point of view that we need to do. So as we're going through that process, there's a couple of gotchas that I wanted to talk about here. So as you're deciding what labels are you going to put where, there's labels can be applied to workspaces that we were just talking about there from the site itself. We can also apply default labels to document libraries. Just say anything that goes into that library is going to get that default label. And we can apply labels to documents either automatically or through just manually applying the label. So if I come back to SharePoint, for example, and I say, hey, I'm just going to go into my SharePoint site collection. So we've created sample site collections in our dev site here. Let's say I want to go into my TLP Amber Teams site. So as a site owner, we can see it's already got a TLP Amber label applied to it. So Microsoft surfaces that label so people understand that, and the description of what it is, when I hover over it, I get that from there. If I'm a site owner, I can come to my site information and I can change that label. So this is where you can set the labels. If I'm an overall tenant admin, I could also do it in my SharePoint admin or in my Microsoft 365 groups admin. You'll see over here in my list of sites, I've got all my sensitivity labels. In fact, I can filter it down here to say, hey, I want to see what all my Amber sites are, and maybe I want to change individual sites. I can modify that at this level. But it's very point and click. If you've got a lot of workspaces, that's going to be pretty onerous. That's why we've got the tenant dashboard, and that's why we've been building automation around that. Now, you can also set defaults at a library level. So if I come back to my Amber Teams and I go to my documents library here, if I go to my library settings, this has a TLP Amber default label. This means any document that I put in here or edit in here is going to get that label. Independent of what label is on the workspace, this applies in the library. Now, the important thing to remember is the default doesn't apply to what's already in the library. So if you've got 10,000 documents in a library and you apply a default, those 10,000 documents don't get labeled. That's one of the things our dashboard does as well, to say, hey, go auto label all those to match the default that's in there. But anything you add or anything that you edit will then inherit that default label. But you got to be careful. Think about if you're going to be mixing lower sensitivity documents in a higher sensitivity team, for example, Purview can send a lot of warnings out to say, hey, you're in a red label team and you've labeled this document as green. Does it really belong here? Is something weird going on? Is there some leakage from a security point of view that you're concerned about? So really think about how you mix those labels from that point of view. The other thing is when you think about the strict labels versus non-strict, they block at the workspace level. So if I've got documents that are being labeled that they can be shared, but they're in a workspace that can't be shared, they can't be shared. So it's something you got to worry about from that point of view. And things like Amber Strict, if you don't do encryption, it doesn't actually block the sharing. Only the containers do that. So there may still be sharing that could happen with those Amber Strict. So you've got to be aware of what that looks like. So from a recommendations point of view, we say, hey, do your team or site sensitivity first, figure out whether it should be strict or not from an external sharing point of view. Maybe create different libraries, but generally make your libraries at a higher sensitivity than your workspace to say, hey, this workspace is Amber, but there's some sensitive stuff that we're going to put in this library, and then set your default labels for those libraries appropriately from that point of view. And if you've got the E5, use the classifiers, figure out where some of that sensitive content is even before you start this planning process, so that you can then get into your pilot group and start going through that process to say, hey, let's filter those workspaces, use that category concept of using our dashboard, decide what you're going to do around that, and then actually apply those policy updates. So this is something that you're very much going to have to work with that pilot group. There's going to be some change management involved from that point of view. So to kind of recap what I was just explaining there, start at the workspace level, apply your workspace labels, figure out, do your libraries match your workspaces, or maybe you've got some higher sensitivity libraries in some workspaces. So decide what that information architecture looks like and set your library defaults from there. And then figure out your labeling process for the documents that are in those libraries. Do you manually apply them? Do you auto label? Do you apply the library defaults? Do you write some PowerShell script to go ahead and do that? And absolutely make sure you've got the change management around that to say, hey, this is what's going to happen. This is what we're doing. This is what it's going to change from a user experience point of view. This is why you need to understand what these different labels mean, and then start to roll it out into your pilot group. And then think about the broader rollout from that perspective. So I know I'm almost out of time here. Didn't quite do my timing from that point of view. Let's just recap from a takeaways point of view. Back to the original takeaways. We do have some resources that we're going to update on the slide deck here, post follow-up from that point of view. We've got some following events and some topics that we're planning, both from an intranet, so kind of an unrelated topic, modern intranet webinar that we want to do either before the end of the year or early in the new year, but also a part 2 to this webinar here around the sharing side and how that fits into the Purview and traffic light protocol that we've just talked about here. If you're keen to try this out, absolutely please come to our Envision IT website. You can come into the Tenant dashboard through here. There is a start a 30-day free trial. Fill out your information. It'll create the account, send you an onboarding email, and you actually go through the whole onboarding process from that point of view. So I'm basically at time. I said I would try and keep some time for questions. I didn't really. Apologies on that. Can hang back for a sec, but if not, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.